Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, what do Canada's social conservatives really care about? Spencer Fernando also joins me to talk about the state of the Canadian conservative leadership race, and I talk about the worst employee ever.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Lots to get to on the program today. Hope you're having a great week. I have actually been in the midst of bureaucratic hell this week as I've been working about the navigation of various access to information departments across the federal government and indeed the Ontario provincial government as well. To preface this, I have no life. I'm aware I have no life. I'm aware how pathetic this is. I have right now, I counted just before the show, 19 active access to information files with various departments from Justice Canada to CBC to Wilfrid Laurier University, just all of these. And I won't go through line by line of what they're all about, mainly because I can't remember them. I've had to, because this has gotten so out of hand, start like a little cataloging system on my computer so I can look through it, the dates that I've filed, the last contact. Like I said, no life. Like this is, some people have hobbies. I just file ATIPs and catalog them and, document and color code them in my spare time. And it's important because when they pan out, oftentimes there's a story there, but to get to that point, you have to question whether it's worth it. And I will say, to Justin Trudeau's credit, and notwithstanding the myriad concerns that I have about how he's run his government, one thing he did well is make it cheaper and easier to file access to information requests. So it used to be you had to pay $5 to file. And then once you filed it, they could say, it's going to take us, 1,000 million, bajillion, gazillion hours. So you have to pay for our time, and that's going to be $17 billion. And now it's just the $5. You don't need to pay above the filing fee. And as far as things government can spend money on, this is not, in my view, the worst idea because access to information is based on the premise that government documents are the public's documents. So I avail myself of this right on a regular basis, and I've done stories about access to information requests and documents I've unearthed in them. But one of the ones that I'm doing right now, or two ATIPs actually, were to Women and Gender Equality Canada. One of them, I wanted to know anytime the term TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminism, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist, all the derivatives, were mentioned in emails, documents, records. And they said nothing. They said that there was no record of that whatsoever. It's never come up. So the department of the federal government that deals with women and gender issues has never talked about trans-exclusionary radical feminism. Seemed a little bit suspect, but okay, I'm a trusting guy. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I filed another request that I really can't believe at all, and it was on the definition of women or female or woman or womanhood, all of these, again, derivatives of the same idea. How does the government department dealing with women's issues define woman? And they say no record at all. Not just they don't have a definition, but it's never been discussed. No one's ever asked. There's no email documents, no documents of any kind dealing with that. And I had a phone call actually from one of the bureaucrats in the Access to Information department there. And again, lovely woman. She seemed like she was trying to be helpful. But I'm like, okay, on the off chance that this is true and these documents don't exist, what on earth is Women and Gender Equality Canada doing all day? If they don't have a definition of what woman is in an age where people are raising sizable questions about this, what on earth are they doing all day? And I still don't know the answer to that question, by the way. And I had reached out as well to the media relations department there, and I said, hey, what's your department's definition of woman? And they said, we'll get back to you, and then they never did. I followed up, no response at all. So I find it baffling to me because this whole department used to be part of another department. It used to be under Heritage. And then the federal government under Trudeau decided, okay, let's make it its own thing, its own team. And they've got many, many, many bureaucrats, and I now have no idea what they're doing all day. So clearly not dealing with some of the core philosophical questions that are relevant to their mandate. This is going to be, I think, one of the defining discussions of the leadership race for the Conservative Party of Canada, and that is the role of social conservatives in the party, in the movement, in the country, and what social conservatives actually believe. And I have to say that 2 days ago, on my first show this week, I talked about social conservatism playing a role in the Conservative Party, and I stand by that. In the context of that, I won't rehash the whole thing, but you should go and listen to it, was Pierre Poilievre rebuffing social conservatives, basically. Now, Pierre has kind of amended via a source that spoke to the Toronto Star his belief. The Toronto Star article said, no, he'll let private members in his caucus introduce bills, but he'll make sure they don't pass. So basically, the Pierre Poilievre position seems to be sabotaging social conservatives, if there are any in his caucus, which there will be because they make up a decent chunk of the Conservative caucus right now in Parliament. So I stand by it that social conservatives need to have a voice and need to play a role in the party. There also comes with that a responsibility for social conservatives to not leave themselves open to the attacks that they know the media are going for. And I have to talk this week about Richard Décarie, the prospective Conservative Party leadership candidate who was on Evan Solomon's CTV show, Question Period, and did not do himself, the movement, or the party any favors. Now, Décarie is not a heavyweight. He's not a frontrunner. He's a guy who was a chief of staff to Stephen Harper before Harper was prime minister back in, I think, 2003 and 4 or 2004 and 5, around there. And he is from Montreal. He's not in office. He's not in power anywhere. He's never held office. He's a guy that seemed to be running solely to say, I'm a social conservative and I'm in the race. And I know he's being backed by some of the people that were backing Brad Trost. So he's got some backing that is legitimate, but he himself is never going to be and was never going to be one of the frontrunners in this race. Yet now he's become the most notable leadership candidate because of this interview that I'm going to play a clip of. Now, there's a clip circulating online that was published by CTV, which is an excerpt of a longer interview. I'm going to play something that's still an excerpt, but it's a longer clip because I think there's some context that was missing. But I'm saying that not to defend Mr. Décarie. I'm just saying that let's have an honest discussion about what's happened in this interview. Let's play this clip for you.
What about same-sex marriage?
Well, I was with Mr. Harper in 2004 when we fought the bill for same-sex marriage. So my point of view is that marriage is exclusive to a man and a woman. And traditionally, it used to be for religion, from a religion point of view. And people are mixed up. When we talk to real people on the street, when we go across the country, we are hearing the same things. We are all mixed up. Our kids are mixed up. So I think it's
what does mixed up mean, sir? So what do you mean mixed up? Sorry,
mixed up in the sense that
people are mixed up.
Yes, that's what they told us. They said that usually traditional family was a man and a woman and children, and now it's everything that the Liberals brought. And because of that, I think we need to make sure that the term marriage is used for a man and woman.
Yeah, but sir, with all, I don't know what you mean by mixed up. You also said normal people. Are you saying people in same-sex couples are not normal?
No, I'm saying that the people that we meet in the street, when we go from door to door, when we are in politics, involved in politics, we speak to real people in the sense that they are telling us their real story. We're not getting the information through the media.
With all due respect, LGBTQ people are real people too. I'm just trying to figure out your terms. Are they not real people?
I think LGBTQ is a liberal term. I don't talk about people that way. I talk about persons, and I think we all need the full respect for being a human being, simply.
Oh, so you don't think that being gay, what do you think that's a choice, or do you think it's biological?
I think it's a choice, and it's how people are behaving. It's one thing. I think government has responsibility to encourage the traditional value that we have had for the past years. So that's the kind of SOCON issues that I would bring as a leader.
Okay. So let's deal with a couple of things first. When he talks about real people, I don't think he's saying that gay people aren't real. I think he's saying that when he's out in the real world talking to people who aren't reporters, who aren't the media, these people are telling him X. And I also think when he says mixed up, I think and I hope he's not saying that gay people are mixed up. I think he's saying that those people he talks to in the world are saying that, just kind of society is messy and mixed up. But again, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt there that may or may not be deserved. I'm just trying to establish that I think the big problem with this interview is not those particular words, but two other things. Number one, him saying it's a choice. I'll talk about that in a moment. And also him getting dragged into this idea that the conservatives need to have a position on homosexuality and that the conservatives should have a position on this. I mean, it was painfully obvious what Evan Solomon was trying to get him to do here, and he went along with it. But I'm not blaming Evan Solomon. I mean, Décarie is the one that has to own what he said and what he thinks and what he feels. And let's have a frank discussion about this, because Douglas Murray, his latest book, The Madness of Crowds, which is a tremendous read, he has a chapter on gay. He does gay, women, race, trans. Those are the chapters. Now, Douglas Murray himself is gay, so he has some insight into this that I don't have. And what Murray points out in his book here that I think is valuable is that we still don't have a definitive scientific understanding or conclusion about what causes homosexuality, he said, but the evidence leans more towards it being innate, what he calls the Lady Gaga born this way approach. But more importantly, there's a societal question, which is that knowing all of the challenges that people who are gay experience, knowing all of the challenges based on social stigma, pressure, all of these things, who would choose that? Who would voluntarily wake up and say, you know what, I want to live this life that's going to be a little bit harder or a lot harder for me. And I think there's a valuable idea that Douglas Murray puts forward there. And I think there's a valuable criticism to Décarie making this claim that ultimately is something that even social conservatives that I know that he's claiming to speak for aren't talking about. I'm not hearing from social conservatives that I know this idea, A, that the conservatives should be wading into homosexuality as a political issue, and more importantly, that it is in fact a choice. That's not something they say. And that's not something they believe or feel, I'd argue, in most cases, not to speak for everyone or anyone but myself and what I've heard people talk about. But the reason I bring this up now is because social conservatives have a place in Canada, in Canadian politics, in conservative politics, and in the Conservative Party. The issues they care about are abortion, some of the transgender ideas that we have now, and again, the major discussions that we have about whether you have to unquestioningly accept someone's preferred gender identity, someone's chosen gender identity, just because they say so in areas like women's shelters, prisons, schools, all of these things. These are significant debates that need to be happening in Canada, and they can only happen when credible and viable voices from the social conservative movement stand up and say, we're unafraid to take these on. That's not happening from Richard Décarie. That's not what was happening in that interview. He was getting up there and was not articulate, by the way, did not do himself, as I said, any favors, because he was hardly taking the effort to ensure that what he was saying was reflecting what he was meaning. And I'm at the point now where I don't quite know what he meant. I don't quite know what he was trying to say. And anyone who wants to speak for a group, whether it's social conservatives or whether it's someone who wants to lead the Conservative Party, you've got to do a better job at not getting sucked into the media's trap. You know, the media has this thing it loves doing at conventions, rallies, protest events, where they find the craziest, most out-to-lunch person they can. They go to them and they put them on camera, and they become the standard bearer of the movement, the rally, the event, the party, whatever. They become the standard bearer. And that is now what's happening with Richard Décarie. It doesn't matter that every conservative leadership candidate and many conservative MPs who are believed that they may run for the leadership jumped and condemned him. The fact of the matter is, now this is going to set the benchmark for what has to be discussed. There are two elements here. Number one, Décarie only exists because there was a vacuum in the party already, in that no social conservatives were saying, yes, I want to run. And now this has changed a little bit. You've got a conservative MP from Eastern Ontario, Derek Sloan, who's a first-time MP, but still he's an elected part of the party. He's running as a social conservative. You've got Leslyn Lewis, who's a Toronto lawyer, another relative unknown, though. And now Décarie is somehow the one that everyone has to respond to. He's the guy that was never going to get more than, a decimal of a percent of a vote in many cases, who's now being held up and reshaping it. I mean, Michelle Rempel, who I get along with very well, she had put out this tweet about how she would never serve under the leadership of someone like him. Well, no, but he was never going to win. So let's discount the people that don't belong in this race, the people that haven't put in the work, the people that haven't actually come to the race because they have a background and a cachet and a credibility. And let's have the real discussions. And I stand by what I said on the show earlier this week, that we cannot exclude social conservatives, but there's also a challenge to social conservatives in here to not let other people hijack your message, to not let people presume or pretend they speak for you, and to talk about the issues that matter, where you can win over people that are undecided, you can win over people that are not necessarily socially conservatives, because you're driving the point of why these issues matter. And you're never going to drive the point of why the government should be enforcing a traditional view of sexuality, which is what Monsieur Décarie said it needs to do, because liberty should be the priority. And I've had this discussion with social conservatives. By the way, I am a social conservative. I have a lot more in common with SOCONs than I have with those who hate them. In fact, I actually quite deplore the hatred we see towards SOCONs. I was endorsed when I ran for office by social conservative groups. So I'm on side on a lot of the issues, especially abortion. But SOCONs have to do a better job at communicating. Everyone in politics has to communicate their message clearly, consistently, and with conviction. And I don't think there was a particular clarity in that interview that we saw on Evan Solomon's show. And you're always going to leave the door open to having your message twisted and distorted if you don't come out of the gate and say, no, this is what I think, this is why, and this is why it matters. Start telling people why these issues are important, and start telling people why it matters that we have a platform to talk about these issues. But more importantly than even that, make sure these issues are real issues. And that's where I think Monsieur Décarie's interview went off the rails, because he was talking about issues that aren't issues and shouldn't be issues in Canadian conservative politics and in the leadership race. There is no one who can tell me there's a benefit in legislating sexual orientations, or even having a government role in setting what a definition for a positive or traditional sexual orientation should be. And by the way, you can have a personal moral objection to homosexuality and maintain that position. I think the healthiest thing that people can do in Canadian society is accept that, hey, my views are my views. They shouldn't be legislated unless something is impeding in the liberty of others or the rights of others. And that's the problem, is that a gay couple does not infringe anyone else's liberty. Abortion infringes the liberty of the unborn. The transgender bathroom issue, that you could say infringes the rights of others. Homosexuality does not. It's not a matter for political leaders. It's not a matter for conservative political leaders to start trying to enforce a definition on this. And that's the reality of it. I got to take a quick break. When we come back, more of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North.
You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I was speaking a moment ago about the importance of clarity in political messaging. No one can ever accuse Donald Trump of not being crystal clear about what he thinks. And I've got to give him a big True North Andrew Lawton Show round of applause for going into the belly of the beast, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and completely taking a flamethrower to climate alarmism that runs rampant, especially this year, but generally at this event. Take a listen to what he said.
But to embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. They predicted an overpopulation crisis in the 1960s, mass starvation in the 70s, and an end of oil in the 1990s. These alarmists always demand the same thing: absolute power to dominate, transform, and control every aspect of our lives. We will never let radical socialists destroy our economy, wreck our country, or eradicate our liberty.
That's just fantastic. I've listened to that like 7 or 8 times now. The perennial prophets of doom, the alarmists of climate that are always wrong, the people predicting the apocalypse. That is fantastic. And this is what I've been waiting for years for a politician to do, to come out and say, yeah, you guys just keep getting it wrong. Why should we listen to you now? Because he's right. They have kept getting it wrong. And not just the situations he was talking about with overpopulation and the end of oil, but the big one as well back in, I think it was the 70s, maybe a little bit of the 80s, was global cooling, the idea that we were, moments away from a new ice age, and then now it's global warming. And this is why they've changed the rhetoric from global warming to climate change, by the way, because they know that with climate change, you can call anything and everything a symptom, whereas with global warming, when you get cold weather, you can't really say, oh, but it's global warming. So now, if it's warm outside, that's global warming. If it's cold, that's global warming. If there's a fire, that's global warming. If it rains and puts out the fire, that's global warming, except now it's climate change. And all of this, I think, is fantastic because no conservative politicians in other countries like the UK, Australia, Canada want to go down the road that Trump did, which is to reject the premise outright. They all try to say, well, no, yes, of course climate change is a problem, but I disagree with your taxing way to deal with it. Whereas Trump is saying, yeah, you guys are always wrong. Why should we start listening to you now? And if you're going to do it, that's the way to do it. I've interviewed Lord Monckton, the 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley, who's just been fantastic on this issue, and Chris Essex as well, Ross McKittrick, Steve McIntyre. They've all done their part to exposing the alarmism, which is exactly what it is, or the perennial doom profiting, as President Trump would say, because all of these people are basing their beliefs on, I'll say debunked concepts, and they're talking about politics. Chris Essex, who's a professor at Western University, has said that he won't do any debates on climate change anymore because the moderators of the debates are not scientists and they only want to talk about politics. He said they're not actually talking about science, about scientific theory, about any of these things, so you can't have a real discussion. And the people in the audience of these events are not scientists, so you can't just start talking about all of these different theories and data points and all of these things. And he said it's just a lost cause, so he writes about it, he explains that way. But there's some truth to that, and that you can't have a conversation in good faith with someone that has already determined what the outcome of that is going to be and has not come to that conclusion through science. And I was doing a debate with someone, not really a debate, it was a radio panel. I wasn't representing myself as a scientist, don't worry. And it was a former Liberal candidate, and she had asked me, thinking it was this gotcha moment, do you believe in climate change? And I said, of course the climate's changing. And she didn't really understand what I had just done there. What she was actually asking is, do you believe in man-made, catastrophic, anthropogenic global warming? What I was saying is, yes, the climate is changing. That's undeniable. But even if you accept, and I think there's probably evidence to suggest that industry and humanity has caused some of the change that we've seen, certainly because of greenhouse gas emissions. But to say that changing climates, which have always changed throughout the course of history, even prior to the Industrial Revolution, is the responsibility and the fault of humanity is wrong. It's not backed up by science. And further to that point, I think this is a more important aspect of this discussion, the solution is not going to come from the Western developed countries that are talking about the issue, because they're not the ones, if we are to blame industry, that are responsible for what's happened. They've already, because industry itself has changed, they're already leaders on this. China, India, elsewhere in the world, they're not. And they're the ones that, if there is a problem that's caused by humanity, the solution has to come from there. It's not going to come from the people in Davos. But there's a little bit of schadenfreude in knowing that at this forum, Greta Thunberg had to hear Donald Trump say, forget about these naysayers and these doom prophets, because she's used to politicians fawning all over her. I mean, Prince Charles and her had a little meeting at Davos, and I'm pretty sure that he was probably bowing to her. So she's not used to a politician actually not going along with it. So he's presenting a challenge for Greta Thunberg right now that she doesn't usually get, because Trudeau goes there, and Trudeau just kind of sits and shrinks down into the shell of a man when he's meeting with her. And at the end of it, she's like, he's not doing enough. I told him that. So everyone else is trying to cater to her. And I'm not one of these people that hates Greta. I think she's a victim and a casualty of the adult stage parents around her. But I do think it's amusing that she's not used to a politician doing this, just as people that liked what he said aren't used to him doing it either. So it's another example of Donald Trump breaking the mold in some respects to the political discussion. I've got to talk about this story here. The worst employee in the history of employees, I think. A British Columbia man who accidentally poured, according to a CTV headline, 16,680 liters of wine down the drain. Now, this breaks my heart in many ways as a wine lover myself. 16,680 liters of wine down the drain at work. He was an employee of the Mission Hill Winery in British Columbia, and according to a labor arbitrator, he had worked there for a decade as a cellarman whose job was to blend wines and transfer them between tanks. Now, part of this process, the article says, required him to run a test to make sure the lines were properly connected between the tanks. He had to check the lines every 15 minutes. Apparently, on November 19th, 2018, one of the valves was left open during a transfer, and as a result, 5,680 liters of Sauvignon Blanc spilled on the floor and down a drain. The estimated value of the wine, $162,500. Now, this legitimately breaks my heart. The decision says he checked the tank 20 minutes after starting the transfer. That's when he realized the wine was spilling. He says, "I was freaking out. I could not believe I forgot to change over the valve," and he felt horrible about the whole thing. So he was fired a month later, terminated with cause, and the termination said negligence in cellar duties, culminating with him pumping 6,000 liters of estate Sauvignon Blanc down the drain. Now, you may be asking, I thought the headline said 16,660. Where does that other 10,680 liters come from? Well, I'm glad you asked, person who doesn't exist right now as I record this. Apparently, 18 months earlier, he made the same mistake and flushed 11,000 liters of wine down the drain and apologized to management, promised to be more careful. And the arbitrator said he agreed he had failed to live up to expectations in that regard. I will say the absolute best line in the story is the one at the bottom. The decision states that in the winery's 50-year history, Mission Hill has only had 2 cellar operation incidents that resulted in a total loss of wine down the drain. Both were the result of Mr. Crozier's actions. So he's like the guy that when he goes on vacation, the "it's been blank days since our last incident" thing goes up, and then once he comes back, it goes down to 0. Anytime there's been a problem, he's been there. So pick a new line of work. Go after anything else. I don't care if you knock over crystalware. I don't care if you damage a barn that you're building. Don't let wine be a casualty of your negligence. That's a PSA from The Andrew Lawton Show. We'll be back in just a couple of moments with Spencer Fernando here on The Andrew Lawton Show.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
So we talked at the beginning of the show about Monsieur Richard Décarie's comments, which are certainly galvanizing the discussions right now about the conservative leadership race. But I will say the last 48 hours has been quite substantial as far as some of the moves in the race. We've got Jean Charest out of the race since the last episode. Rona Ambrose formally announcing she's out. Now, she was previously on the fence, and even though reports said she was out, there were also reports saying she might still be thinking about it. Rick Peterson, who ran in 2017 and got 0.67% of the vote, has decided he's running again, so that could be a bit of a game changer as well. And who else do we have this week? Derek Sloan, the Conservative MP I mentioned, is running, and Leslyn Lewis, who's a lawyer in Toronto, is running. So none of these are as huge, though Charest's departure, which Stephen Harper we know was gunning for, and Rona Ambrose formally signaling she was out, I think do certainly set a tone for the race and for which other candidates are going to get in. I heard that Rick Peterson, who's quite close to Rona Ambrose, wasn't going to run unless he knew for sure that she was out. So there may be some other people that now that she's out for sure will say, all right, maybe I'm in now. We'll see how that unfolds. But I do want to talk about this and some of the other things facing Canadian politics, and who better for that than Spencer Fernando, the commentator, blogger, writer, and as his Twitter profile says, the best and most modest writer in Canada. Spencer, I know we've talked online a couple times, but it's good to talk to you directly. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, no problem.
So let's talk about, this last 48 hours in the leadership race I just mentioned. We've had Rona Ambrose confirm she's out, Jean Charest out, Richard Décarie, who I talked about earlier in the show, redefining, I think, what a lot of social conservatives in Canada actually care about, not what he was talking about, and certainly bringing some skepticism to the conservative leadership race. Right now, is this shaping up about how you expected it to when Andrew Scheer stepped down?
Yeah, it's looking like it's going to be establishment candidate, Peter MacKay, versus somewhat of a more, I guess you could say, conservative-based candidate in Pierre Poilievre. But they're both, they've both been conservative MPs, both part of the Harper cabinet, so I don't think it's going to be especially divisive at this point.
One of the things that I found interesting, when we had the 2017 race, there were, at one point, I think 14 candidates running, and no one really got out of the race. And this time, the committee of people on leadership duty decided, okay, let's triple the entry fee, or double it rather, and we'll basically increase the number of signatures required, and hopefully that will cause fewer people to be in. It doesn't seem to be working out that way. I know we don't have the deadlines yet, but there are still a lot of people that have never held office before that seem to be running and organizing campaigns.
Yeah, because I think it's staggered in terms of the goals. There's the top line goal of signatures and money you need to stay in the race, but you can get in for a while and be in for a while with some lower tier goals. So I think there's really an incentive for some people to say, hey, I'll try it out, see if I get some traction. If I don't, then they just quit. But if they do, then maybe they get more attention than they would have otherwise. So I think in the early period, we'll see some people running, but if they can't meet the goals, then they'll be dropping out.
So let's talk about the Rona Ambrose factor here, because this is the one that I'm convinced would not have done as well as people like to think if she were in the race. That's not an indictment of her. I just think that a lot of her popularity comes from the fact that everyone knows she's not running. And I think that she was probably thinking about it actively, finally came out this week and said definitively, no, I'm not running. And of course, on cue, you've got people saying, oh, I wish Rona were running. Why can't she be running? But where do you think it is that support for her is coming from? Because I think a lot of the reason that she was so popular when she was the interim leader is because she wasn't threatening anyone's ambitions for the longer term leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think part of it, I know there was Brad Wall seemed to be pretty supportive. Some had said Harper was supportive. Who knows?
Jason Kenney as well.
Yeah. So, they definitely had some establishment, and not the so-called, political establishment in the way that people consider, just popular with the media. Brad Wall, Jason Kenney, pretty popular with the conservative base as well. So she had support there. I think she's seen as someone who was from the West and also electable, so she could hopefully win over much of the Western base of the party and then still get elected in some of the areas that conservatives need. But apparently she's pretty happy in the private sector and didn't want to get back in. And politics can be a tough business, so I guess she decided to stay out for now.
So I guess on that note, electability, this is a word that I think is important. You obviously have to have a conservative leadership candidate who conceivably could be elected as conservative leader. But how much do you think that should weigh into people deciding who to vote for? Because in some sense, I get the drive that people have towards something of an ideological purity test as well.
Yeah, well, I think the more important thing to look at is communication skills, because you can have opinions that may not be popular with everybody in the country, but if you're a good communicator, then you can persuade people. That's something that often gets left out of politics. People seem to want to just do a focus group, see what's popular, and then just present that to people. Well, sometimes you need to persuade people as well. And I think that's the strength Pierre Poilievre has. Is he's definitely improved as a communicator. If you see him in question period, he's quick on his feet. He'll be good in a debate. And so I think it's not necessarily how electable someone seems right now, but how good their communication skills are. If they can communicate well, then they can push. I mean, the Conservatives are going to get whoever their candidate is. The establishment media is going to attack them and demonize them, right? So you have to have good communication skills to fight back against that. And I think so far Pierre Poilievre has shown he's the best communicator.
Yeah, you raise a valid point. I've made this comment in other fora before, that the media's favorite conservative is the one that's not running, and the media's least favorite conservative is the one that's closest to winning. And I think that Pierre Poilievre and Rona Ambrose and Lisa Raitt and all of these people who at one point have been the media's preferred ones, once they were to get to that point where they were the leader, everything would change and they'd be turned on them. I think, where was it that we saw that? Certainly in Ontario, Christine Elliott, who was running for the PC party leadership, was the one the media loved, but had she won, they would have turned on her. So I do think there needs to be a sense of understanding that is how it's going to go. And, I've said before, and I think you've said as well in other capacities, that, conservatives have to start pushing back on a lot of this and not just accepting the premise that the media tends to put forth.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've already seen a few photos. I think it's Peter MacKay wearing a shirt which has a Canadian flag on one half and then looks like a gun on the other. And I think he was supporting either an organization or might have been a military cause. But some on the left are already saying, "Oh, he's crazy extremist." I mean, so
Peter MacKay, the right-wing extremist.
But that's what they're going to say. They're going to say that about anybody, right? So you have to be able to fight back against that. The other thing, I think something that disappointed me a bit from the campaign, 2019 campaign, was I think the Conservative missed an opportunity to really appeal to a lot of, like what you're doing, right, with new media sources that are more open to listening to the Conservatives and less biased really against the Conservatives. They would complain about, the media is not treating us well, and the media didn't treat them well. But why not just invite a whole bunch of people to all the briefings? When they go to the House of Commons and they're in the Ottawa Press Gallery, why not invite all the alternative media in the country? You don't have to shut out the establishment media, but just, you in some ways drown it out with a bunch of different voices. So I think it'll be interesting to see if any of the leadership candidates are willing to do that and more open to alternative sources.
That's a huge problem, though, Spencer, because when I did a daily talk radio show on conventional radio, the one thing that I saw is that during leadership campaigns, the conservative politicians would just absolutely flock to anywhere there's a conservative audience. So that's talk radio, new media as well. And then once there's a general election, it's like pulling teeth to get an interview. And I'm not trying to overstate my own influence or my own audience, but it's interesting that in leadership races, and I'm assuming we'll see this in the next couple of months as well, conservatives are saying they're scrambling just to get the message out. And then once Andrew Scheer was the leader, it was very difficult to sit down. And I'm like, hang on, you've still got to talk to Canadians here. You've still got to win votes. And that is a huge problem because you've got to win over all Canadians, or at least Canadians that come not just from the conservative base, but you've also got to give the base a reason to show up and the base a reason to get excited and get involved. And you are right about that. A lot of that is going to have to come from breaking away from that traditional media stranglehold on communication, and not to make everything a comparison to Trump, but that's what Trump has effectively done, is bypassed the reliance on the media that's typically been there for a politician to get their message out.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I mean, if you look at some of the tweets you did in the campaign, especially when the Liberals were trying to kick you out of events, I mean, you were getting thousands of retweets, and then people tweeting about you were getting thousands of retweets. So you were getting a ton of attention. So I don't know why the Conservative Party didn't really pay more attention to that. And, overall, if the Conservatives are so worried about media bias, which obviously is a problem, well, the key to getting rid of that or to push it back against it is to help facilitate the rise of alternative media, right? So if there's a whole separate media that's more open to the Conservatives and less biased, then that kind of negates a bit of the effect of the biased establishment press. So again, I was surprised they didn't do that more in the campaign. I would think probably Pierre Poilievre. He seems he's pretty good on Twitter. I think he probably sees what's going on. So we'll see if he gets it, and maybe Aaron O'Toole and Peter MacKay will get it as well. But yeah, if they don't, if they just try to, we'll just win over CBC, we'll win over CTV, we'll win over Global, they're just going to get the same result next time.
So on that note, what do you think need to be the big priorities, not just on style, which we've been talking about, but even policies? What would you love to see a conservative leader come in and do, or a conservative leadership candidate in this case come out and promise?
Yeah, well, one thing I think is immigration, and they're obviously going to be worried to talk about and very careful. But there's a very fascinating disconnect between the way you see every poll when they ask Canadians about immigration and then the way the political class and the media talks about it. Canada, I think, brought in had net migration of about 420,000 people last year. The U.S. had about 570,000 people net into the country. So pretty similar to Canada, except they're 9 times bigger than us. Every poll shows Canadians are not really happy with the massive immigration increases we're seeing. They want a lower level. And the Conservatives, they're kind of wishy-washy, not wanting to talk about it. But if you look on social media and you look at comments on websites and what people are saying, there's clearly within, I think, the core Conservative base a desire to talk about it. And it's a rare issue where, what the Conservative base really wants is also exactly what you see a lot of Canadians saying. But what makes it such a kind of a rare thing is the Conservatives don't even want to talk about it. So I think that's going to be key to success in the long term for any Conservative leadership candidates. They have to be careful how they talk about it, obviously. But again, that's where what we talked about before, facilitating the rise of alternative media. The establishment media any Conservative who even says immigration will just quickly right away. But, people like yourself and myself are more willing to actually listen to that conversation and to share it in a reasonable way without panicking about it. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how it's addressed. Immigration is one of the most consequential things for a country. And if we keep bringing in more and more people and more Canadians are against it, then at some point, someone in politics is going to start addressing those concerns.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that disconnect. One example that comes to mind is, I guess it was a year and a bit ago when the Conservatives had their big policy convention and the topic of ending birthright citizenship came up. The media just went into an absolute tizzy about it. And even the Conservative communication machine distanced itself from this policy that was put forward. And then I think it was about a month ago or a month and a half ago, CBC ran this big investigative feature about the birthright tourism scam in Canada and the problem with all of these people that come here just for this. And then all of a sudden, in a second, it became palatable to talk about, even though last year these were the same people saying you're not allowed to do this. So it shows that there is an appetite for this, but you need someone that's prepared to risk that criticism imminently to get through on a message that will resonate with Canadians.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like the party's still almost waiting for permission from CBC or the media to talk about certain issues. And I can understand they're kind of afraid, but again, that's why you facilitate alternative media. It gives you more of a chance to talk about those things. Interesting what you said about the disconnect. It's funny because if you look at the media, you see almost no discussion of the Conservative view on immigration. And then you see, same-sex marriage brought up all the time. But if you look at what the party base actually did, I mean, a few conventions ago, or policy convention, they voted, I think 2/3 voted to end the party's past opposition to same-sex marriage. So for, I'd say, most members of the party, that issue is in the past, not really an issue they talk much about, but they want to talk about immigration. And then you see the party and the media not talk about that at all. So I think whoever can figure out how to really, reach people on those issues and really get past that disconnect, I think we'll have a lot of success, and it remains to be seen whether any of them will do that.
Yeah, and I was talking about that earlier in the show with the Richard Décarie stuff. It's that even social conservatives are not talking about those issues anymore. And in some cases that maybe they've just made a calculation and realized that's not the best issue. But I think more often it's that they just don't care about that anymore. There are bigger fish to fry. And I think even social conservatives have realized that it's more advantageous to focus on the issues that ultimately matter to Canadians and ultimately have a really fundamental question at stake about rights and humanity and all of that stuff. And I think that for the media, their vision of what five conservatives in a room are talking about is basically evidence that they've never been in that room when conservatives are talking. I mean, more often than not, if you and me and people we know were to get together, we'd probably be complaining about supply management. We'd be complaining about things like that. And gay marriage wouldn't come up, yet that's where they go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when Pierre Poilievre, I think a few days ago, said that he supported same-sex marriage. I did a quick article just on what he said. And most of the comments were people saying, I don't even care about this issue anymore. I want to hear them talk about immigration or the United Nations or the military or the economy. So there's really, I think, and as you say, the media really has no idea what conservatives are talking about. They assume, oh, this must be a big issue. There must be tons of support for these candidates talking about it. Most people, they don't really care. They don't want to hear about it anymore, and they want to move on to other issues.
Yeah, so do you think immigration is that issue? Because immigration still has that polarization in the ability to trigger that media backlash. But at the same time, I think it is, as you mentioned, a pretty significant challenge for Canada. And even though I think discussion has probably slowed down a little bit, we don't have as much of an issue at Roxham Road as we did a year ago, there still are great challenges that we're facing, and also the repercussions of the last year and a half of Canadian immigration policy.
Yeah, well, the irony is that if Canada wants to maintain support for immigration, then it has to be at a level that most Canadians will support, right?
Yeah.
I think the lesson in a democracy is the elites in the establishment, they can stop an issue from being talked about or discussed for a long time, but not forever. Sooner or later, in a country where people are relatively free to vote for who they want to, relatively free to express themselves, it's going to be expressed in one way or another. So we'll see if anyone in the party gets that. The economy is obviously always going to be a key issue for the Conservatives as well.
But I know you mentioned True North's and my struggles attempting to cover the campaign in October. I have to say thank you for all your support through that period. It was very much appreciated at a time
you're
when
welcome.
It was feeling like the walls were coming in. So thanks for that, Spencer.
Yeah, well, thank you for all you were doing there. That looked pretty tough out there, but you kept fighting.
Yeah, I'm glad it wasn't like the 12-week-long campaign of 2011 or 2015, I think it was. I'll say that. But in any case, thanks very much for all you're doing, Spencer Fernando. You can get his stuff, spencerfernando.com or Spencer Fernando on Twitter. And as well, thanks for joining me today. It's good to talk to you directly.
Yeah, it's great talking to you.
Spencer Fernando, his stuff is great. As I mentioned, I've corresponded with him before, but we've never actually spoken. So it was like a blind date. We just get thrust in the same room together digitally, and I am very pleased with that conversation. Some good insights there. And that does it for us for this show and this week. Hope you have a great weekend, folks. We'll be back next week with more of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. I do have to put in a pitch, though, before we go. If you can support what we're doing by joining the Andrew Lawton Show Club or the Producer Circle with a monthly contribution, it would go a long way to keeping the lights on and letting this show continue to go and have the discussions, especially through the leadership race that we're going to have. You can do that at andrewlawtonshow.com. That's it for me. Thank you all. Thank you. God bless, and good day, Canada.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.